The quiet human at the academy. Heen stepped carefully through the grand doors of the Galactic Academy, his weathered leather bag hanging from his shoulder. The cool air inside felt strange, different from the sterile atmosphere of military bases he had known. All around him, young aliens rushed by, some with blue skin, others with extra limbs, a few even floating, hovering just above the ground. These were not the ordinary beings Heen had dealt with before. He could tell immediately. This was not the military base where order and structure ruled above all. He was alone in a sea of color and movement, but he didn't mind. He kept his head down, his face expressionless. He had long since learned to control his emotions and reactions. Here, in this academy of young minds and new worlds, he needed to blend in. His gaze flicked over the towering walls, with strange plants growing along the edges, their roots spiraling out in odd patterns. The architecture was nothing like anything he had ever seen on Earth. It was beautiful, yet foreign, an uncomfortable reminder of how far he was from the world he knew. The floors were polished with a reflective sheen, and the air smelled faintly of something metallic, a scent Heen couldn't place. "Excuse me," came a voice from the side, cold and unnerving, like metal scraping against stone. He turned to face a tall, thin alien with green scales. The alien's eyes gleamed with intelligence, a touch of curiosity, perhaps even judgment. "You must be the new human student," it said with an air of distant superiority. "I am Professor Exel. Welcome to the Academy." He bowed slightly, the movement smooth and graceful, clearly practiced. "Thank you," Heen replied, his voice flat. He had no time for pleasantries. "I'm just looking for my room." The professor handed him a small, clear tablet, its surface flickering to life as it registered his touch. The map of the academy appeared in glowing lines on the screen, pointing out the various towers, halls, and facilities. "Your roommate will help you adjust," the professor said, already moving away as if there were more important matters to attend to. Heen looked at the map, trying to familiarize himself with the vastness of the academy. The academy's campus was gigantic, much bigger than anything he had seen before. It consisted of 5 towers, connected by sparkling glass bridges that hovered above beautiful gardens and small lakes. This place was nothing like the military bases he had served in, where the walls were bare and functional, designed for efficiency and command. Here, everything seemed to be designed to impress, lush and elaborate, intricate in a way that felt almost decadent. As Heen walked down the corridor, he noticed groups of students from various planets talking animatedly, their voices creating a gentle hum in the air. The young aliens were in all shapes and sizes, each one carrying the mark of their home world in their appearance. Some had wings, others had multiple arms or glowing skin, but all of them seemed to ignore the lone human among them, with some even pointing and whispering under their breath. "Look at how he moves," a blue-skinned student whispered to another, a chuckle in their voice. "So stiff, so slow." How primitive. Heen didn't react. He had heard far worse. He was used to being an outsider, to being the subject of scrutiny. But he had learned long ago that the best way to deal with such comments was to ignore them. So he did, keeping his gaze focused ahead as he walked. He reached his dormitory, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, a young man with black hair looked up from a floating screen. The light from the screen reflected off his face, casting soft shadows across his features. "You must be Heen," the young man said, offering a warm smile. "I'm Tahoe. I'm human too, though I was born on New Sol Station. My parents were from Old Earth, but I never lived there." Heen nodded, setting his bag down on the edge of the bed. "Nice to meet you," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Tahoe, apparently eager to help, immediately grabbed Heen's tablet. "Let me show you how things work around here. The tech can be tricky, but you'll get used to it. Trust me." Heen watched as Tahoe's fingers flew over the screen, explaining the meal systems, class schedules, and the various social groups that dominated the academy. Heen's mind, however, wasn't on the tech or the schedules. His focus was on the room, the way the windows could turn into screens at will, the furniture that reshaped itself based on need, and the security system that seemed to analyze every person who entered. There were scanners embedded into the walls, invisible to the eye, but Heen knew they were there. He had spent years dealing with technology like this, in much darker settings. Tahoe continued speaking, oblivious to Heen's silence. There are different houses for students, each with its own unique focus. House Blue is all about strategy and intellect. I'm in House Blue, actually. You should consider joining. It's a good fit for someone like you. Heen didn't respond immediately. Houses, strategy. It all sounded irrelevant. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't here to play their games. He was here to observe, to keep his head down. His mind drifted back to Earth, to the days when he had been a part of something far greater, when his every move had been calculated, when victory meant survival. But that was behind him now. He had a different task ahead of him, learning. Peace, not war. Tahoe, noticing Heen's distant expression, stopped talking. Hey, you okay? Heen turned to him, his expression unreadable. Just tired, he muttered. He could feel the weight of the days ahead, the pressure to keep his identity hidden. Here, in this academy, there were many things that could be discovered. Too many. Tahoe smiled. Well, if you need anything, just ask. We're all in this together, right? Heen nodded, though he didn't believe it. He wasn't part of their world. Not yet. Later, when Heen left the room to attend the welcome dinner, he couldn't shake the feeling that every eye in the room was on him. The hall was filled with students from 100 different worlds, and the food on the tables was as diverse as the aliens themselves. Bright-colored liquids, glowing fruits, and unfamiliar meats. Music that was foreign to human ears played softly in the background, setting the atmosphere in the grand hall. Heen chose a seat away from everyone, eating in silence. His posture was perfect, his movements calculated. But a group of large reptilian aliens at a nearby table kept staring at him. Their eyes were cold, filled with disdain. Tahoe leaned in to whisper, "Those are drawn. They're a very militaristic society. They think humans are weak, so it's best to avoid them." Heen glanced at the drawn leader who had risen from the table, his red scales glistening under the lights. The drawn's deep voice echoed in the hall as he approached Heen. "So this is what Earth sends us now," the drawn sneered, his voice low. "An old human. At least send your warriors if you want respect." Heen looked up slowly, meeting the drawn's gaze. A flash of coldness crossed his eyes, an imperceptible shift. But it was gone in a second, replaced by the same polite indifference. "I'm just here to learn," he said quietly. The drawn laughed and walked away, his disdain palpable. Heen sat back, his eyes distant. He could feel the tension in the air, the judgment, but it didn't matter. He had been in far worse situations, and this was nothing. Back in her office, Director Sven, a tall woman with piercing silver eyes, reviewed Heen's file. She clicked through the minimal information. Age 43, born on Earth, previous occupation listed as administrative work in the Earth Defense Department. But there was nothing else. No history of formal education, no past military service. Something didn't add up, she thought to herself. Why would Earth send someone like this to the Academy now? She sent a request to Earth for more information, then closed the file, not thinking much more of it. After all, one quiet, middle-aged human student was the least of her worries in an academy full of the galaxy's brightest minds. What she didn't realize was that the quiet human in her academy was far more than just another student. Heen had a story, and that story was just beginning. The first day of the academy. The first few days at the academy passed in a blur for Heen. His new life had settled into a quiet, predictable routine. He woke before dawn, his body conditioned to rise at the first sign of light, even though here, on this distant world, there was no true dawn to speak of. The 3 moons of the planet hung in the sky like frozen lanterns, casting a soft glow over the landscape. Heen took solace in the stillness of those early hours when no one else was awake, and he could simply sit by the window and watch the world, this strange new world, come to life. His exercises were simple: stretching, bending, moving through slow, calculated motions that would have looked like basic stretches to anyone else. But to Heen, they were a means of maintaining control, of staying sharp. He had done this every day for years, long before coming to this academy, long before Earth had sent him on this journey. By the time the students began to stir, Heen had already completed his morning routine and was ready to begin his day. He would head to breakfast, where his roommate Tahoe would greet him with a smile and offer some lighthearted banter. Though Heen rarely participated in the conversation, he didn't feel the need to. To him, small talk was unnecessary. Words were a tool, not a weapon. And in this place, with its constant noise and hustle of students from all over the galaxy, Heen was content to be as quiet as possible. The less attention he attracted, the better. Classes began each morning, and Heen sat in the back like he always did. He kept his face neutral, his posture impeccable, his mind alert, but his hands rested idly on his desk. He was here to learn, not to stand out. He answered when called upon, and only when called upon. His answers were always precise, well thought out, demonstrating a deep understanding of the material, particularly in diplomatic theory, conflict resolution, and intergalactic history. His professors seemed impressed by his knowledge, but they didn't push him for more. They saw him as a quiet, older student who had lived a full life, and perhaps didn't have the energy to engage with the young, brash minds surrounding him. He was an anomaly in the classroom, older than most students, human, and yet, somehow, always just a little too perfect. In practical lessons, Heen played the part of the underperformer. He stumbled over holographic controls in the technology classes, pretending to be confused when it came to alien systems, despite knowing exactly how to disassemble and reassemble them in a matter of minutes. He played the role of the primitive human to the letter, never showing his true capabilities, never drawing attention to himself. It was easier this way. He couldn't afford to reveal the truth. He couldn't afford to let anyone know who he really was. Yet, even as Heen kept his head down, he couldn't help but notice the growing attention from his peers. Some whispered about him behind his back, their curiosity piqued by his calm, stoic demeanor. Others seemed to take pity on him, thinking that someone so obviously out of place, an aging, unremarkable human, must be struggling to adapt. Tahoe, his roommate, was the most persistent. He had taken it upon himself to ensure that Heen felt welcome in the academy, despite Heen's obvious reluctance to socialize. He always seemed to be there, offering help and friendly advice, whether Heen asked for it or not. One afternoon, as they sat in the cafeteria eating their meal, some sort of protein-based dish that looked and smelled nothing like anything Heen had ever encountered, Tahoe nudged him and said, "So, how are you liking it here? Everyone's so different, right? I bet it's overwhelming sometimes. You're doing well, though. Don't be afraid to join in more. We're all part of this big intergalactic community now." Heen barely looked up from his food. He chewed slowly, his face impassive. "I'm just here to learn," he said quietly. "That's all." Tahoe smiled knowingly. Of course. But you've got to admit, the social part is fun too, right? You've got to make some friends. I'll introduce you to some other people in House Blue. They're all pretty chill." Heen didn't respond. He didn't need to. He wasn't here for friends. He wasn't here for games. He was here because Earth had sent him, and because he had a job to do. He had never been one for socializing. There was a time for that, but not now, not in this place. Later that day, during tactical communications class, Heen's patience was tested again. The professor, a tall and thin alien with multiple forearms, spoke slowly, explaining the intricacies of alien communication systems, both mechanical and biological. Heen was supposed to be struggling with the tech, but instead, his fingers itched to correct the holographic display in front of him, to tear it apart and rebuild it. He held back, forcing himself to fumble with the controls. "That's not right," Professor Lax said, his voice full of irritation as he watched Heen's missteps. "Humans really are behind the rest of us, aren't they?" The class chuckled at the professor's comment. Heen nodded politely, pretending to be embarrassed. No, I'll get it. It's complicated," Heen said, continuing to fumble with the holographic tech. It wasn't complicated for him. It never had been. But Heen kept up the act, knowing that it was the only way to stay unnoticed. After class, as Heen gathered his things, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Sunwoo, the small alien with the bright yellow eyes, the one who had noticed his unusual precision earlier. "You're not really that bad with tech, are you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly as she looked up at him. Heen blinked, his mind immediately running through the possible consequences of admitting the truth. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Sunwoo smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Your fingers. They move too precisely. And sometimes, when you fumble, you stop yourself just before doing it the right way. It's like you're holding back on purpose. Don't worry. I won't tell anyone. But I'm not blind, you know." Heen didn't know how to respond to that. He couldn't very well tell her that he had spent years training soldiers, that he had commanded entire fleets, and that alien technology was no challenge for him. Instead, he smiled faintly and shrugged. "I just have a little trouble adjusting to new things," he said. "It's nothing, really." Sunwoo didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press him further. She just gave him a friendly wave and walked away. Heen watched her go, his mind racing. He had been careful, so careful to keep his skills hidden. But now, it seemed like someone was starting to see through the facade. He would have to be even more cautious in the days ahead. That night, when he lay in bed, the familiar weight of his past settled over him. The images of battle, of strategy, of the thousands of lives that had hung in the balance, filled his mind. He had fought in wars, led armies, commanded ships, but here in this peaceful academy, he couldn't afford to show any of that. It was harder than he expected, harder to hide the instincts, the training, the sharpness that had been drilled into him for years. But he had no choice. He had to survive here, to remain hidden, to complete his mission. But something else stirred in him as well, a small, flickering feeling that had been buried beneath years of conflict. The faintest spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was something more to life than war. And maybe, just maybe, this academy could teach him what that something was. For now, though, Heen kept his thoughts to himself. Tomorrow would be another day of pretending, another day of blending in. He could only hope that the truth didn't catch up with him before it was too late. The dream haunting. The days began to blur together as Heen continued to settle into his new life at the academy. His early morning routines remained a constant, as did his quiet, methodical approach to classes. But there was one thing that refused to remain routine: the dreams. They started on the second night after his arrival, at first faint and distant, like echoes from the past. But as the days passed, they grew more vivid, more intense. And as they deepened, Heen found it harder and harder to ignore them. Each night, it was the same. He would lie down, close his eyes, and drift into a sleep filled with visions of battlefields, of shouts and explosions, of commands issued over a crackling comm system. In the dream, Heen was no longer a quiet student in an alien academy. He was a general again, commanding soldiers in the middle of a war. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, the lives of thousands hanging in the balance. "Hold the line at Sector 7, he would shout, his voice sharp, cutting through the chaos of the battlefield. "Redirect forces to coordinates 348912. Operation Blackstone is still active." He could feel the adrenaline, the urgency, the endless need to make the right choice, to save his people, to protect Earth from the invaders. The dream was always so real, so tangible, that when Heen woke up, He would be drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling. On the fourth night, the dream was even more vivid. He was standing on the bridge of his command ship, staring at a holographic display of a star system under siege. The lights of distant planets flickered, weak and dim under the assault of enemy ships. He heard the voices of his officers calling out orders, their panic evident in the comms. "General Park, we're losing the fleet. The enemy's reinforcements are coming in fast. We can't hold much longer." Heen's eyes narrowed, his mind working at lightning speed. He knew the stakes. He knew the battle would determine whether Earth survived or fell. "Redirect the fleet to this position," he commanded, his voice steady, calm, despite the chaos around him. "We'll trap them in the gravity well of the second planet. Use the pull to our advantage. Don't give them any room to maneuver." It was a last-ditch maneuver, a gamble that only someone like Heen, a veteran of hundreds of battles, could make. He knew it would either save Earth or doom them all. But even as the strategy formed in his mind, he felt the weight of the lives at stake. His eyes flicked to the status readouts on the bridge, the names of crew members who had served under him. And he knew each decision would cost someone, somewhere, their life. Then the scene changed. Suddenly, he was on the battlefield, leading a small contingent of soldiers. His feet hit the dirt, the cold night air stinging his skin as blaster fire lit up the horizon. His soldiers moved with precision, following his every command. But as they advanced, Heen saw it. An enemy sniper, hidden in the trees, a threat to his team. Without thinking, Heen reacted instinctively, signaling his squad to take cover while he neutralized the sniper. In that split second, as his soldiers moved to safety, Heen saw a flash, a light, an explosion, a teammate falling, screaming as the blaster fire tore through his body. That was the moment Heen always woke up. Every night, without fail, he would see the face of the soldier who had died in his place, hear the desperate screams, and know that the death was on his hands. The screams were the hardest part, the unrelenting reminder of the consequences of war. He had lost so many soldiers, so many people who had followed him, trusted him. The weight of their deaths was something Heen had never been able to shake, no matter how many victories he had won. And it was these faces, these memories, that came back to him in the dead of night, haunting him with the reminder of who he had once been. That night, after another restless dream, Heen awoke with a start. His body was tense, his eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the faint hum of the academy's air systems, the occasional distant footsteps of students in the hall, but it all seemed so far away. He was still trapped in the memory of the battlefield, in the chaos and pain of those final moments. His breathing was shallow, and his hands were clenched tightly at his sides. Tahoe, who had been sleeping soundly across the room, stirred at the noise. "Heen." Tahoe's voice was soft, filled with concern as he sat up. He blinked against the darkness, trying to focus on his roommate. "You okay?" Heen didn't answer right away. He lay there for a moment, his chest still heaving with the aftershock of the dream. He had to force himself to relax, to breathe deeply, to remind himself that he wasn't on a battlefield anymore. He wasn't commanding troops. He was here, in this peaceful academy, far from the war zones of his past. "I'm fine," Heen said, his voice hoarse. He sat up, rubbing his face with one hand. "Just a bad dream." Tahoe was silent for a moment, sensing that it was more than just a bad dream. "Want to talk about it?" he asked cautiously. Heen shook his head. "No, it's nothing." He forced a smile, trying to ease the tension. "Just a dream. I'm fine." Tahoe seemed to accept this, though he didn't look entirely convinced. He just nodded and lay back down, muttering, "Well, if you ever want to talk, I'm here." He nodded, grateful for the kindness, but he knew there was nothing to say. The dreams were his burden to carry. The past was his alone to bear. It had always been that way. The next day, Heen tried to push the haunting memories aside. He joined Tahoe and the other students for breakfast, though his mind was still distant. The halls of the academy buzzed with excitement as the annual combat simulation was approaching. Some of the students were eagerly discussing the event, talking about tactics, strategies, and which houses had the best chance of winning. "It's going to be intense this year," Tahoe said, slapping Heen on the back. "Are you excited? House Blue has a great team. I'm sure we'll go far." Heen smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sure." Tahoe looked at him for a moment, a slight frown tugging at his lips. "You sure you're okay, Heen? You've been a little out of it lately." Heen shrugged. "Just tired, I guess." He couldn't bring himself to say anything more. The truth was, he was struggling. The past was like a shadow that hung over him, and no matter how far he ran, it always found a way to catch up with him. It was easier to keep his distance, to pretend to be just another student in a sea of aliens, to not let anyone get too close. But it was harder than he expected. The kindness from Tahoe, from the other students, Sunwoo in particular, was starting to chip away at the walls he had carefully constructed around himself. Heen didn't know how much longer he could keep up the facade. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faintest glimmer of something warm flickered in his chest. A thought, a hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. What if for once, he didn't have to hide? What if just this once, he could let go of the past and allow himself to be something else? But those thoughts were quickly drowned out by the weight of his past, the screams, the deaths, the battlefields. No matter how much he wanted to change, he couldn't escape the man he had been. The man who had led, who had fought, who had lost. For now, all he could do was survive the academy, pretend to be just another student, and keep his nightmares at bay. At least for a little while longer. The challenge of peace. Heen's days at the academy continued to drift by in a pattern of quiet observation and calculated silence. Every morning, he woke before the first light of the 3 moons, as his body instinctively followed the rhythms of the military life he had left behind. There was peace in this routine, in the repetition that demanded no questions, no explanations. Yet, even in the quiet corners of the academy, Heen could feel the weight of the world around him pressing down on his shoulders. He was no longer part of the war, yet the war had never truly left him. His classes, which once seemed like a welcome escape, began to feel more and more like an illusion. As the days passed, Heen realized that the galaxy was filled with students who were eager to solve problems, to use their intellect to make the universe a better place. But their strategies for peace and diplomacy lacked something fundamental. They had never fought in a war, never led men and women into battle. They hadn't lived the sacrifice, the true cost of conflict. It was in these moments that Heen struggled. He had seen the chaos that peace talks could never prevent, the devastation that had followed after too many people trusted the wrong leaders, the wrong systems. He had seen the desperation in the eyes of soldiers who didn't want to fight anymore, but had no choice. He had given orders that changed the lives of millions. And yet here, in this place, peace seemed so simple, so naive. Every day, Heen took a seat in the back of each classroom, avoiding unnecessary attention. He answered when called upon, never raising his hand, always calm, always deliberate in his responses. His classmates would sometimes glance at him, wondering why a man who was clearly older than the others, and who came from such an unexpected place, chose to remain so silent. Even Professor Exel, who had initially greeted him with cold politeness, had begun to wonder if Heen was truly interested in the curriculum, or if he was simply there to pass the time. Despite his reluctance to engage, something about Heen's quiet presence began to stir curiosity. It was in his movements, in the way he held himself. No one could ignore the sense of discipline that radiated from him, a discipline that seemed far beyond what was required by the Academy's curriculum. He moved like someone who had been trained for far more than academic excellence. He had the presence of someone who had commanded armies, not attended lectures. Tahoe noticed it first. One evening after class, as they walked back to their dorms, Tahoe casually asked, "So, Heen, you ever thought about joining House Blue's leadership program?" Heen glanced at him, the briefest flicker of confusion crossing his features. "Leadership program? Yeah. It's a group of students who work on real-world problems. Tactics, strategy, that kind of thing. You know, the stuff we'll actually use when we graduate." Tahoe grinned. "You're really good at theory and analysis, and I'm sure you've picked up a lot more than you're letting on. I thought you'd be perfect for it." Heen shook his head, refusing the offer with a simple, "I'm not here for leadership programs." Tahoe raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Fair enough. But you know, I think people are starting to notice you, man. People who want to learn something practical could learn a lot from you." Heen's eyes darkened for a brief moment, but he quickly masked his reaction, offering Tahoe a tight smile. "I'm just here to learn," he repeated. But the words tasted bitter in his mouth. Wasn't that why he was here? To forget the war and its aftermath. To learn something new, something that didn't involve combat, strategy, or the cold decisions of leadership. The challenge Heen faced wasn't just with the academy or his classes. It was with himself. He had fought wars, he had commanded soldiers, and he had sacrificed much. Now on this quiet, peaceful planet, he was supposed to learn diplomacy, negotiation, and peace-building. He was supposed to relearn what it meant to be human without the pressure of military conflict. But the world around him wasn't that simple. The more Heen observed, the more he realized the cracks in the academy's teachings. The instructors were brilliant, yes, but they lacked the grit of someone who had been tested in the fires of battle. There were theories about diplomacy, about conflict resolution, but Heen knew that theories fell apart in the heat of the moment. He knew how easily peace could be shattered when one wrong word, one misstep, could lead to the deaths of thousands. It was something he had witnessed firsthand. The students, too, were well-meaning, but naive. They had learned about the horrors of war from textbooks, not from experience. They spoke of peace, but their understanding was based on idealistic visions, not the stark, brutal reality Heen had lived through. That afternoon, during a class on interspecies diplomacy, the professor showed footage from a peace conference between two warring species. The footage displayed endless rounds of negotiations, a plethora of words exchanged. But in the end, the peace talks had failed. The tension in the room was palpable as the two sides began shouting, each blaming the other for the conflict. It wasn't long before the diplomats turned to their bodyguards for protection. The fragile peace shattered once again. "We see this all too often," the professor said, shaking his head. "When words fail, violence seems like the only option left." Heen watched the footage closely, his eyes hardening. He had seen it all before, the same patterns, the same futile attempts at peace. But what the professor didn't say, what none of the students seemed to understand, was that words weren't enough. Words could build bridges, yes, but only when both sides were willing to cross them. And too often, they weren't. After class, Heen lingered in the hallway, lost in thought. He could hear the voices of students around him, discussing the footage, talking about how peace should always prevail. He wanted to join in, to explain how it wasn't always that simple, how peace was often the casualty of stubborn pride and greed. But Heen remained silent, the weight of the years pressing down on him. Sunwoo, the small purple-skinned alien who had noticed his precise movements in class, approached him as he walked to his next lecture. She smiled at him, but her eyes were filled with a curious intensity. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said. "You're always so calm, so controlled. You've been here longer than anyone else, haven't you?" Heen turned his gaze to her, wary. "What do you mean?" "You're different," Sunwoo said, tilting her head. "I've been watching you. You're always quiet, always thinking. But there's something more, isn't there? Something you're not telling anyone." Heen met her eyes, and for a brief moment, he thought about the choice he had to make. Should he tell her the truth? Should he confide in someone finally? Or should he continue playing the part of the quiet, unremarkable student? He chose the latter. "I'm here to learn," Heen said flatly. "That's all." But Sun Mu wasn't convinced. "Maybe, but there's more to you, Heen. I can tell." Heen didn't respond. He couldn't. Later that day, after another tedious class, Heen found himself once again alone in his room. The silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence he had craved at first, the kind that allowed him to hide his past, to forget the war. But now, as he sat there, the stillness felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the academy, this so-called peaceful sanctuary, wasn't enough to escape what he had done. He needed something more. But what? What could he possibly learn here that would make the weight of his past easier to carry? A knock on his door broke him from his thoughts. He turned to find Tahoe standing in the doorway, a warm grin on his face. "Hey, I'm heading to the training room to practice some strategy games," Tahoe said. "You in? We could use someone with your mind on the team." Heen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Maybe, just maybe, a small part of him wanted to try. To be more than just the quiet student. To find something, anything, that could give him the peace he so desperately sought. "All right," Heen said quietly. "I'm in." Perhaps this was his chance, not to be the general again, but to learn something different, something new. The war games begin. The day the war games officially began, the energy in the academy was electric. It had been building for weeks. Students from every house had been preparing, strategizing, and fine-tuning their skills in anticipation of the grand competition. This wasn't just another tournament. The war games were more than just a test of physical prowess or quick thinking. They were designed to challenge the minds of the galaxy's future leaders. The stakes were high, and the atmosphere buzzed with an intensity that Heen couldn't ignore. Heen had known the moment he agreed to join House Blue's team that the war games would be nothing like the simple, theoretical exercises they had practiced in class. The combat simulations they had been shown in their lectures were merely a shadow of what would unfold in the arena. Here, it was real strategy, real pressure, and real consequences. For some students, it would be their first test of leadership, of true tactical skill under fire. But for Heen, this was something different. He had fought in wars before, real ones, not simulations, and he knew the cost of losing, the price of failure. But this wasn't about life and death. This was about winning the game, about proving his worth in a way he had never considered. The first round of the war games was simple enough. Each house had to capture territory while defending their own base. Heen, along with his teammates from House Blue, stood in the massive holographic war room, watching the interactive map unfold before them. The map showed a virtual battlefield, complete with terrain, obstacles, and enemy positions. They were given an hour to plan, and then the clock would start. Tahoe was at the head of the group, as eager and confident as ever. "All right, team, listen up," he said, tapping the screen and highlighting the valley that ran through the center of the map. "We attack through this pass. We'll use the cover of the terrain to sneak up on House Red's forces. We've got the numbers on our side, so a full frontal assault will catch them off guard." Heen studied the map for a moment, noting the paths Tahoe had outlined. The plan was sound, but it was too aggressive for the situation. He had seen this before. Battles that were lost because commanders underestimated their enemies or rushed into the fray without considering all their options. "I don't think a frontal assault is the best move," Heen said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "They'll expect us to attack through the valley. It's predictable. We'll be exposed. We need to flank them from the side, draw them into the open where we have the advantage." Tahoe looked at him, surprised by the suggestion. "You're sure about that?" he asked, his tone more uncertain than usual. He nodded, his voice steady. "We have to force them to make mistakes. Take the higher ground, use the terrain to control their movements. We move fast, then hold position. Let them come to us. A murmur of approval spread across the team. Even Sunwoo, who had been quiet until now, nodded in agreement. It could work. We could force them into a trap. All right, I'm convinced, Tahoe said with a smile. Let's do it your way, Ian. Heen felt a flicker of pride, but he quickly suppressed it. This wasn't about pride. It was about winning. He wasn't here to prove something to anyone. He was here to do his best and get through the games without drawing attention. But as the plan unfolded, he couldn't help but feel the rush of excitement that only came with the thrill of a well-executed strategy. When the war games finally began, Heen's team moved swiftly into action. The digital battlefield came alive as their avatars appeared on the screen, their units placed precisely where Heen had suggested. They moved quickly, executing the plan with the precision that Heen had expected. House Blue's forces positioned themselves on the high ground, hidden among the trees and rocky outcrops that dotted the map. The enemy, House Red, fell right into the trap. They took the bait, sending most of their forces directly into the valley, exactly where Heen had anticipated. The moment House Red committed, House Blue pounced. Their units flanked the unsuspecting enemy, cutting off their retreat and surrounding them on three sides. Move in. Take the position, Heen shouted, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. He wasn't commanding soldiers anymore, but the words still felt the same, sharp, decisive, demanding action. Tahoe, his face lit up by the glow of the map, called out instructions to the team, guiding their forces as they closed in on House Red's remaining troops. Within minutes, House Red's forces were cornered, their positions surrounded by House Blue's strategic placements. Victory came swiftly. House Blue had won the first round, and the other teams in the arena watched as the results appeared on the central scoreboard. That was amazing, Tahoe said, grinning widely as he high-fived Heen. We actually pulled it off. I knew we'd make it work. Heen nodded, but his expression remained calm. It's just the first round, he said. There's still a lot more to come. The games continued for hours, and House Blue steadily advanced through each round. Every time they faced a new challenge, Heen was quick to assess the situation, adapting their strategies to fit the unique circumstances. But each victory came with a price. Heen could see the tension building in his teammates. They were all brilliant students, yes, but the pressure of the games was starting to weigh on them. They were beginning to doubt themselves. By the time they reached the semifinals, House Blue had become the team to beat. They had won 3 rounds, each more difficult than the last, and now they faced their toughest opponents yet. House Red, led by Braxton, the fierce, drawn student who had challenged Heen when they first met. Braxton's reputation as a ruthless tactician was well known, and Heen couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension. This wasn't just a game anymore. House Red had lost before, but now, with everything on the line, they would fight with everything they had. As the final round began, the stakes had never been higher. House Blue stood ready, but Heen knew they would have to pull out all the stops to win. Braxton's forces were formidable, and their aggressive tactics could easily overpower the more measured approach Heen had suggested. But Heen wasn't afraid of an all-out battle. In fact, he relished the challenge. It reminded him of the wars he had fought, battles where every move counted, and the consequences of failure were too great to ignore. This is it, Heen said, his voice low and steady as he looked over the final map of the arena. If we don't act quickly, we'll be overwhelmed. We need to make a decisive strike, get into their flank, and take out their heavy artillery. We'll move in and finish this. Tahoe nodded, his earlier confidence now mixed with determination. You're right. We got this. The battle began, and almost immediately, House Blue's forces moved forward, taking the fight directly to House Red. Braxton's forces countered quickly, and the two teams collided in a flurry of action. It was chaos, but Heen remained calm. His mind worked like a machine, calculating the best possible moves with every passing second. House Blue's tactics were precise, and each move Heen made brought them closer to victory. Braxton, however, wasn't going down without a fight. He sent his forces charging directly into the heart of House Blue's position, using sheer aggression to try and overpower them. "Push through. Take them down," Braxton shouted, his voice echoing through the simulation. Heen's response was calm, yet sharp. "Hold the line. Keep your positions and wait for the right moment." It was the same strategy Heen had used countless times before in real battles. Wait for the enemy to overextend, then strike when they were vulnerable. And that moment came. Heen signaled to his team, and with a series of well-timed maneuvers, House Blue trapped House Red's forces, cutting off their escape and forcing them into a corner. The final blow came as House Blue's heavy units launched a coordinated attack, disabling House Red's remaining artillery. When the simulation ended, the scoreboard flashed. House Blue had won. The room erupted in cheers, but Heen stood quietly, observing the aftermath. Braxton's face was a mask of frustration and disbelief. He had underestimated the quiet human who had led House Blue to victory. Tahoe, his face beaming with excitement, turned to Heen. "We did it. We actually won. We're in the final." Heen nodded slowly, his eyes already moving to the next challenge. "It's not over yet," he said. "The real test comes now." The final round of the war games was approaching, and Heen knew that the hardest battles lay ahead. House Blue had earned its place in the final, but the question remained, could they maintain their momentum? Could Heen's quiet strategy stand up to the chaos of the final challenge? He was about to find out.